The taste of copper floods Kalen's mouth before he's even fully conscious, coppery and sharp, matched only by the stench of burnt chitin and searing ozone clinging to the recycled air of his helmet. His HUD flickers, stutters, then slams to life with two angry red icons pulsing in the upper left corner: Corporal Voss, Private Lyra, KIA. The rest of the squad's markers glow a dull, tired amber, their status ticking between wounded and critical. He pushes a slab of fused ice and Zalari carapace off his chest, the armor of his chest plate groaning under the weight, and rolls to his feet, his left cybernetic eye fizzing with static as it calibrates to the dim, pulsing bioluminescence of the dying hive tunnels around them. "Sound off," he barks, his voice gravelly, raw from breathing filtered air laced with smoke for the last 72 hours. The comms crackle, one after another, 8 voices responding, tight with exhaustion. Rurk's comes first, gruff and edged with pain. "Rurk, heavy weapons. Jax's leg S crushed. I'm dragging his ass. He's conscious, barely." Mara's voice cuts in next, sharp as a scalpel. "Mara, demolitions." "Pack scorched but functional. 1 charge of shaped plastic left, 2 frags. Don't ask me to do any precision cuts with it, though." Corporal Hale, the squad medic, reports last, his voice uncharacterily strained. "Hale, medic. Voss took a spine to the throat. Lyra got crushed by falling rock. Jax's leg S got Zalari acid in the wound. It's spreading. I patched it, but he's got maybe an hour before it hits his heart." Kalen's gaze sweeps the tunnel around them. The hive's inner structure is groaning, ice melting from the heat of the core blast dripping from the ceiling in slow, thick rivulets that pool around their mag boots. The walls are lined with the iridescent, razor-sharp resin the Zalari used to bind their tunnels, still warm to the touch, and the faint blue glow of the hive's fungal food sources is fading, sputtering out as the core's power dies. Somewhere far above them, the ice moon's crust is cracking, the distant boom of collapsing tunnels echoing through the rock like artillery fire. The comms are still alive for now, but the Zalari's bioelectric interference is getting stronger the deeper they push, and Kalen's cybernetic eye is already showing streaks of green static every time he glances at the tunnel mouth ahead. "Move out," he orders, gesturing for Rurk to bring up the rear, Hale to stay with Jax at the center of the column. "Double time, keep your spacing, watch your step. This whole fucking mountain S coming down around our ears." He doesn't mention the ammo count. They're down to 3 mags each for their standard issue Gauss rifles. Rurk has 427 rounds left for his 30 rotary cannon, and Mara's last explosive charge is tucked in her pack like a holy relic. He doesn't mention that the ASF High Command declared them KIA 3 days prior, left them stranded behind Zalari lines with no evac, no resupply, nothing but the promise that if they survived, they'd be court-martialed for unauthorized deep space ops. They all know. They've been living it for 6 months, jumping from hive to hive, killing Zalari by the thousands, watching their squad shrink from 12 to 8, until the core blast that just collapsed half this moon felt less like a victory and more like a stay of execution. They move through the tunnels in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their mag boots on frozen chitin, the wet gurgle of Jax's breathing over the med channel, the distant groan of shifting ice. Mara walks point, her Gauss rifle held low, her gloved fingers brushing the wall every few steps, testing for hidden doors. She's the only one who can read Zalari glyphs, a skill she picked up after the ASF dumped her on a Zalari prison colony for smuggling meds to civilian refugees, a detail she's never spoken out loud but Kalen has seen etched into the inside of her helmet, a tiny glyph scrawled in marker next to her rank. "Hold up," she says after 10 minutes, her hand raised. She's standing in front of a stretch of tunnel wall that looks identical to every other stretch, but her fingers are hovering over a glyph carved almost too small to see. "This is a service access, leads to the primary dock. The hives don't have docks unless they've got something big enough to need one." Rurk hefts his rotary cannon, the skull painted on its barrel glinting in the faint fungal light. "World killer big," he rumbles, his jaw tight. His sister's face is scratched into the metal next to the skull, a reminder of Epsilon Eridani IV, the colony the Zalari glassed 3 years prior with a planet killer, just like the one Kalen's been hunting ever since. Kalen doesn't answer, just nods. Mara taps the glyph and the wall slides back with a wet, squelching sound, revealing a dark tunnel sloping downward, the air coming out of it colder than the rest of the hive, smelling of sulfur and rot. The tunnel opens into a cavern so large their helmet lights don't reach the ceiling, the far wall lost in shadow. And there it is, the Zalari world renderer, 2 kilometers of living, breathing chitin, iridescent black, veined with pulsing blue bioluminescence that thrums like a heartbeat. It's docked at the far end of the cavern, tethered to the hive by a thick, fleshy umbilical that pulses in time with its veins, egg sacs the size of houses lining the cavern walls, all dormant now that the core is dead, oozing a thick yellow fluid that smokes when it hits the ice floor. The hum of its engines vibrates through the rock, up through Kalen's boots, rattling his teeth, and for a second he can't breathe, can only see the orange sky of Epsilon Eridani IV, the Zalari planet killer hanging in orbit like a black hole, cracking the planet's crust open like an egg. Fuck me sideways, Rurt breathes, his voice tight. That's the thing that glass chapter 2, the cavern swallowed them whole, the silence broken only by the pulse of the renderer's veins and the crunch of their boots on ice slick with alien secretion. Kalen's visor fogged with his own breath, the recycled air tasting of copper and ozone. He forced himself to keep moving, each step deliberate, each muscle taut with the memory of firestorms and collapsing cities. The world renderer loomed ahead, its silhouette a living monolith, a predator asleep but breathing, its bioluminescent veins casting shadows that writhed like serpents across the cavern walls. Form up, Kalen growled, his voice low, clipped, carrying the weight of command. His squad tightened formation, rifles raised, eyes scanning the cavern's expanse. Mara moved to his left, her weapon steady, her jaw clenched. Rurt brought up the rear, muttering curses under his breath, the sound of a man trying to keep terror from boiling over. The renderer's umbilical cord pulsed, thick as a battleship's hull, feeding into the hive wall. The fleshy conduit throbbed with a rhythm that matched Kalen's heartbeat, and for a moment he wondered if the ship was aware of them, if it could feel their intrusion like a parasite burrowing into its flesh. 2 clicks of chitin and bile, Mara whispered, her voice sharp as a blade. How the hell do we kill something that's alive? Kalen didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed on the renderer, its surface glistening with a sheen of moisture, its hull flexing as though it inhaled. He remembered the sky of Epsilon Eridani IV, remembered the crust splitting open, magma fountains swallowing cities whole, remembered the screams over comms as the colony burned. His sister's face etched into the skull on his rifle was not just a reminder, it was a promise. Kalen, Rurk hissed, his voice tight, we're standing in the belly of the beast, if it wakes, we're ash. Kalen raised a fist, silencing him. He crouched, running a gloved hand across the ice floor. The yellow secretion from the dormant egg sacs hissed where it pooled, eating into the ice, releasing a stench that clawed at the back of his throat. He forced himself to breathe through it, to focus. We don't wake it, Kalen said finally, his voice a growl. We cut the cord, sever the umbilical, starve it. Mara's eyes flicked to the pulsing conduit. That thing's thicker than a destroyer's spine. We'd need charges, heavy ones. Kalen nodded. We brought them. The squad moved, boots crunching, rifles sweeping arcs of light across the cavern. The renderer's engines hummed, a vibration that rattled their bones, a reminder of the power coiled inside its living frame. Kalen felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the knowledge that this thing had ended worlds, had turned thriving colonies into glass deserts. They reached the umbilical. The fleshy conduit towered above them, its surface slick, veins bulging, fluid coursing through it in thick pulses. Mara reached out, her glove brushing against it. The surface was warm, alive, and it shuddered at her touch. She jerked her hand back, eyes wide. It knows, she whispered. Kalen set his jaw. Then let it know we're here to kill it. He dropped his pack, pulling out the charges, rectangular blocks of composite explosives, their surfaces etched with glyphs of warning. He handed them out, his movements precise, deliberate. Mara took hers with steady hands. Rurk's fingers trembled as he armed his, muttering prayers under his breath. Set them deep, Kalen ordered. We need to rupture the core flow. If we just scar it, it'll heal. They pressed the charges into the conduit, the flesh resisting, then yielding with a wet squelch. The explosives sank into the pulsing tissue, disappearing beneath the surface. Kalen set his own, his gloves slick with alien secretion, the stench burning his nostrils. He forced himself to focus, to ignore the bile rising in his throat. Timer set, Mara said, her voice steady. 3 minutes, Kalen nodded. Fall back. Cover the retreat. They moved, boots pounding across the ice, rifles sweeping arcs of light. The cavern seemed to close in around them, shadows writhing, the hum of the renderer's engines growing louder, deeper, resonant. Kalen felt it in his chest, in his bones, a vibration that threatened to tear him apart. Then the renderer stirred, the veins along its hull flared, bioluminescence surging, casting the cavern in a sickly blue glow. The umbilical convulsed, the charges buried within it bulging against the surface. A sound filled the cavern, a low, guttural moan, the sound of a leviathan waking. Move, Kalen roared. They sprinted, the cavern shaking, ice cracking beneath their boots. The renderer's engines flared, the hum rising to a roar, the air vibrating with power. Egg sacs along the walls shuddered, fluid spilling, smoke rising. The cavern became a storm of sound and motion, the renderer awakening, its presence overwhelming. Kalen's lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he forced himself forward, every step a battle. He remembered the firestorms, the screams, the faces lost. He would not die here, not before he saw this monster burn. The charges detonated. The cavern erupted in light and sound, a shockwave tearing through the ice, the umbilical convulsing, rupturing, fluid spraying in torrents. The renderer screamed, a sound that shook the cavern, a sound of rage and pain. Its veins flared, then dimmed, its engines faltering, the hum stuttering. Kalen stumbled, the shockwave throwing him to the ice. He rolled, came up on one knee, rifle raised. The render writhed, its hull flexing, its bioluminescence flickering. The umbilical lay in ruins, severed, fluid pooling, smoking. Mara crouched beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide. Did we kill it? Kalen stared at the renderer, its massive frame shuddering, its engines faltering. He shook his head slowly. Not yet. The renderer's hull split, a fissure opening, fluid spraying. From within, shapes moved, Zalari drones, their bodies sleek, chitinous, eyes glowing with cold light. They poured out dozens, then hundreds, swarming across the cavern floor, their screeches piercing. Rourke cursed, raising his rifle. Here we go. Kalen rose, his rifle steady, his jaw clenched. Hold the line, we finish this. The cavern became a battlefield, rifles barking, drones shrieking, the renderer writhing in agony. Kalen moved with precision, every shot deliberate, every motion controlled. Mara fought beside him, her weapon blazing, her face a mask of fury. Rourke screamed curses, his rifle spitting fire, his body a whirlwind of desperation. The drones swarmed, their claws flashing, their bodies slick with alien fluid. Kalen fought, his mind a storm of memory and rage, his body a machine of war. He remembered his sister's face, remembered the firestorms, remembered the promise. He would not stop, he would not fall. The renderer screamed again, its hull splitting wider, its bioluminescence flickering, dying. The cavern shook, ice cracking, shadows writhing. Kalen fought, his rifle blazing, his heart pounding. And in that moment he knew this was not just a battle. This was vengeance. This was survival. This was war. Chapter 3, The Shattered Maw. The cavern was no longer a cavern. It had become a furnace of shrieking metal and alien flesh, a place where the air itself seemed to burn with the static of dying machines and the stench of ruptured Zalari ichor. Kalen's boots slid across the fractured ice, his rifle barking in disciplined bursts, each round punching through the chitinous armor of a drone that leapt too close. His breath came ragged, but his eyes were steady, cold, locked on the renderer's massive, collapsing frame. The renderer was dying, but it was not dead. Its hull split wider, the fissure yawning like the maw of some abyssal beast. From within, the glow of its bioluminescent core pulsed erratically, casting the cavern in alternating washes of sickly green and blood-red light. Every pulse seemed to summon more drones, spilling them into the chaos like a tide that refused to ebb. Mara's voice cut through the din, sharp and commanding. Kalen, left flank collapsing. He pivoted, his rifle swinging, catching sight of Rourke staggering back as 3 drones closed in, their claws flashing. Kalen moved without thought, his body a weapon honed by years of war. He fired, 2 drones crumpling mid-leap, their bodies skidding across the ice. The third reached Rourke, claws slashing, but Rourke roared, driving his rifle butt into its face, then finishing it with a point-blank burst. Still breathing, Rourke spat, his voice ragged, his face streaked with blood. Barely, Kalen's jaw tightened. Hold the line, we break them here. The cavern shook again, a deep rumble reverberating through the ice. Shards fell from the ceiling, smashing into the battlefield, crushing drones and scattering soldiers alike. The renderer's scream followed, a sound that was not mechanical, not alive, but something in between. A hybrid howl of machine and beast, a death cry that rattled bones and made the air taste of copper. Mara ducked behind a jagged outcrop, her rifle blazing. It's birthing them faster, we're not cutting the flow. Kalen's mind raced. He could see it, the renderer's core flickering unstable. The drones were not endless, they were being forced out, torn from the machine's dying body. If they could sever the core, if they could collapse the fissure, the tide would break. He slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, his hands moving with mechanical precision. We push to the maw, cut the core, that's the kill. Rourke barked a laugh, bitter and wild, straight into the beast's throat. You're insane. Kalen's eyes met his cold steel. Insane or dead. Choose. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, broken only by the shrieks of drones and the renderer's dying wail. Then Rourke grinned, teeth bared, madness in his eyes. Fine, let's gut the bastard. Kalen surged forward, Mara at his side, Rourke trailing with curses and gunfire. They moved like a blade, cutting through the swarm, every step a battle, every breath a gamble. Drones lunged, claws flashing, but Kalen's rifle spoke, precise and merciless. Mara's fire was relentless, her movements fluid, her fury a storm. Rourke fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting death, his voice a constant stream of rage. The fissure loomed ahead, a wound in the renderer's body, glowing with unstable light. The heat radiating from it was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of burning flesh and ruptured machinery. Drones poured from it, their bodies slick with fluid, their eyes glowing with cold hunger. Kalen's heart pounded, his mind a storm. He remembered the firestorms, the cities burning, the faces of the dead. He remembered his sister's eyes, wide with fear, before the Zalari took her. He remembered the promise he had made, to fight, to endure, to never stop until the enemy was ash. He raised his rifle, firing into the maw, each shot tearing through the drones that spilled forth. Mara was beside him, her weapon blazing, her face a mask of fury. Rourke screamed curses, his rifle spitting fire, his body a whirlwind of desperation. The fissure widened, the render convulsing, its bioluminescence flickering, dying. The cavern shook, ice cracking, shadows writhing. Kalen fought, his rifle blazing, his heart pounding. And then he saw it, the core exposed, flickering, unstable. A sphere of light and machinery, pulsing erratically, its glow casting the cavern in sickly hues. It was the heart of the beast, the source of the drones, the key to its death. Kalen's voice was a roar, commanding, unyielding, target the core. Bring it down, Mara's rifle swung, her shots precise, tearing into the exposed machinery. Rourke followed, his fire wild but effective, rounds punching into the glowing sphere. The core shuddered, its light faltering, its pulses growing erratic. The renderer screamed, a sound that shook the cavern, a sound that was both death and defiance. Drones poured forth in desperation, their bodies slick with fluid, their claws flashing. They fought with frenzy, with madness, with the desperation of a dying beast. Kalen fought, his body a machine of war, his mind a storm of memory and rage. He fired, he moved, he killed. Mara fought beside him, her fury unrelenting, her weapon blazing. Rourke screamed curses, his rifle spitting fire, his body a whirlwind of desperation. The core shuddered again, its light faltering, its pulses slowing. The renderer convulsed, its hull splitting wider, its bioluminescence dying. The cavern shook, ice cracking, shadows writhing. Kalen's voice was a roar, commanding, unyielding. Finish it. Their rifles blazed, their shots tearing into the core, ripping it apart, collapsing its unstable light. The core screamed, its glow faltering, dying. The renderer convulsed, its hull collapsing, its bioluminescence fading. And then silence. The drones faltered, their movements slowing, their eyes dimming. They collapsed, their bodies crumpling, their claws falling still. The renderer shuddered, its hull collapsing, its light dying. The cavern shook, ice cracking, shadows writhing. Kalen stood, his rifle steady, his jaw clenched. His breath came ragged, his heart pounding. He looked at the renderer, its massive frame collapsing, its light dying. He looked at Mara, her face streaked with blood, her eyes blazing. He looked at Rourke, his body battered, his face streaked with sweat, his eyes wild. And in that moment he knew this was not just a battle. This was vengeance. This was survival. This was war. The renderer was dead, but the war was not over. Kalen's voice was low, steady, commanding. We move, the planet killer waits. Mara nodded, her eyes blazing. Rourke spat blood, his grin wild. Then let's take it. They turned, their rifles steady, their bodies battered but unbroken. The cavern lay in ruins, the renderer dead, the drones fallen. But beyond, the war waited, and they would not stop, they would not fall, they would not rot, they would fight, they would endure, they would win. Chapter 4. The cavern's silence was not peace. It was the silence of aftermath, the silence of corpses cooling in the dark. The renderer's husk lay broken, its bioluminescent veins extinguished, its once living hull now a carcass of alien steel and flesh. The air stank of ozone and burnt chitin. Every breath rasped through Kalen's lungs like sandpaper. They moved. Boots crunched over shattered drone limbs, over the slick residue of the renderer's collapse. The cavern stretched into a jagged throat of ice and stone, its walls trembling with the echoes of distant machinery. Somewhere beyond, deeper in the frozen tunnels, the planet killer waited, a weapon vast enough to erase continents, a machine of annihilation stolen from the enemy's own arsenal. Kalen's rifle hung low but ready, his finger brushing the trigger guard. His eyes scanned every shadow, every fissure in the ice. He could feel the weight of command pressing against his skull, heavier than the rifle, heavier than the armor plates strapped to his chest. Mara walked beside him, her face streaked with dried blood, her jaw set like iron. Rourke limped, his grin feral, his body battered but unyielding. Keep formation, Kalen muttered, voice low, clipped. We're not ghosts yet. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them into single file. The walls glistened with frost, veins of alien alloy running like scars through the stone. The hum of distant power pulsed faintly, a heartbeat buried in the planet's bones. Mara's voice cut through the silence, sharp, commanding. That hum, it's the reactor, the killer's core. We're close, Rourke spat blood onto the ice, his grin widening, close enough to taste it. Kalen raised a fist, halting them. He crouched, pressing a gloved hand against the wall. The vibration was steady, rhythmic, alive. He closed his eyes, listening. It was not just machinery, it was a pulse, a rhythm that spoke of something vast, something waiting. His eyes snapped open. We're walking into its throat. Stay sharp. They advanced. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, a cathedral of ice and steel. The ceiling arched high above, jagged with stalactites of frozen alloy. The floor was a lattice of alien machinery, glowing faintly with veins of power. And at the center, rising like a monolith, was the planet killer's core. It was colossal, an engine of annihilation, a sphere of black alloy wrapped in coils of living metal. Its surface pulsed with faint light, veins glowing like embers beneath the skin. The hum was louder here, a low, resonant thrum that shook the bones. Kalen's breath caught. He had seen weapons before, bombs, cannons, orbital strikes, but this was different. This was not a weapon. This was a god of destruction, a machine built to erase worlds. Mara's eyes blazed. We take it, we turn their god against them. Rourke's laugh was ragged, wild. Or we die trying. Kalen stepped forward, his boots ringing against the lattice floor. His rifle was steady, his jaw clenched. He felt the weight of every soldier who had rotted in deep space, every comrade left to die in the void. This was vengeance. This was survival. Form perimeter, he ordered. Mara, get me a read on the core. Rourke, cover the flank. They moved with precision, battered but disciplined. Mara knelt, her hands flying over the alien console embedded in the floor. Her fingers danced across symbols that glowed faintly, her eyes narrowing as she deciphered the alien script. Rourke limped to the edge of the chamber, his rifle sweeping the shadows, his grin fading into grim focus. Kalen stood at the center, staring at the core. His mind raced. How did one seize a weapon built to erase planets? How did one bend annihilation to their will? Mara's voice broke the silence. It's alive, the core. It's not just machinery. It's symbiotic. It's bound to the enemy's command protocols. Kalen's jaw tightened. Can you break it? Her eyes flicked up, blazing. I can try. But it'll fight back. Rourke's voice was a growl from the shadows. Then let it fight. We've killed gods before. Kalen's gaze swept the chamber. The walls trembled faintly, the hum deepening. Shadows writhed at the edges, shapes moving in the dark. He raised his rifle, his voice sharp, commanding. Contact, eyes up. The shadows erupted. Drones poured from fissures in the walls, their bodies sleek and jagged, their eyes blazing with cold light. They moved with inhuman speed, claws slicing through the air, voices shrieking in metallic chorus. Hold the line, Kalen roared. His rifle blazed, shots tearing into the drones, sparks flying as metal shattered. Mara ducked low, her hands flying over the console, her face twisted in concentration. Rourke's rifle thundered, his laughter wild, his body moving with brutal precision. The chamber became chaos, gunfire echoing, drones shrieking, the core pulsing with light. Kalen's breath came ragged, his heart pounding. He moved like a predator, every shot precise, every movement calculated. Mara's fingers bled as she tore at the console, her voice a hiss of fury. Rourke fought like a beast, his rifle blazing, his fists smashing drones into shards. Kalen, Mara's voice was desperate, commanding. It's fighting me, the core, it knows we're here. Kalen's eyes blazed. Then break it. The drones surged, claws flashing. Kalen's rifle blazed, his movements relentless. He felt the weight of command pressing against him, heavier than the rifle, heavier than the war. He knew if Mara failed, if the core resisted, they would die here. Mara, his voice was a roar, unyielding. Finish it. Her fingers flew, her eyes blazing. The console screamed, symbols flashing, light pulsing. The core shuddered, its veins blazing with fire. The hum deepened, shaking the chamber, shaking the bones. Rourke's laughter was wild, feral. It's breaking, it's ours. The core convulsed, its surface cracking, light blazing. Mara screamed, her hands tearing at the console, her voice a hiss of fury. Kalen's rifle blazed, his movements relentless, his voice commanding. And then silence. The drones faltered, their movements slowing, their eyes dimming. They collapsed, their bodies crumpling, their claws falling still. The core shuddered, its light blazing, its veins pulsing. Mara's breath came ragged, her face streaked with blood. She looked up, her eyes blazing. It's ours, the planet killer, it's bound to us now. Kalen's jaw clenched, his breath steady. He looked at the core, its light blazing, its power pulsing. He looked at Mara, her face streaked with blood, her eyes blazing. He looked at Rourke, his body battered, his grin wild. And in that moment he knew this was not just survival. This was vengeance, this was war. The planet killer was theirs, but the war was not over. Kalen's voice was low, steady, commanding. We move. The enemy will come for it, and when they do, we'll be ready. Mara nodded, her eyes blazing. Rourke spat blood, his grin feral. Then let them come. They turned, their rifles steady, their bodies battered but unbroken. The chamber lay in ruins, the drones fallen, the core blazing. But beyond, the war waited, and they would not stop, they would not fall, they would not rot, they would fight, they would endure, they would win. Chapter 5. The silence between breaths, the chamber still burned with the afterglow of conquest. The core's light pulsed like a living wound, veins of molten brilliance crawling across its surface, casting jagged shadows that danced across the ruined walls. The air was thick with the stench of scorched alloy and the acrid tang of blood. Every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a reminder that they had survived where they should have perished. Kalen stood rigid, rifle lowered but not forgotten, his eyes locked on the core. Its radiance painted his face in stark relief, the hard lines of command etched deeper by exhaustion. His jaw was clenched, his mind already racing ahead, calculating the inevitable counterstrike. The enemy would not let this theft stand. Mara staggered forward, her boots crunching over the husks of fallen drones. Their bodies lay twisted, claws bent, optics shattered, the remnants of a machine army that had once seemed unstoppable. She pressed a bloodied hand against the console, her fingers trembling as she traced the glowing runes that now obeyed her touch. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried the weight of triumph. It listens, she whispered, half to herself, half to the void. It bends, the planet killer is ours. Rourke leaned against a fractured bulkhead, his grin feral despite the blood dripping from his split lip. He spat crimson onto the floor, the sound sharp in the silence. Then we've stolen their god, he rasped. Let's see how they scream when we turn it against them. Kalen's gaze snapped to him, steel in his voice. Not yet, we don't wield it until we understand it, until we know it won't consume us as it consumed them. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the core. Mara's eyes flicked to Kalen, blazing with defiance. You think we can afford caution? They'll come. They'll come with fleets, with armies, with everything they have left. If we wait, we die. Kalen stepped closer, his boots grinding against shattered plating. He towered over her, his voice low but commanding, each word a blade. If we rush, we die faster. This weapon is not a rifle you can aim and fire. It is a beast. Beasts must be tamed. The tension hung heavy, the chamber suffocating with the weight of their choices. Rourke chuckled, the sound raw, broken. Then tame it quick, Commander, because I can already smell them coming. As if summoned by his words, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the corridors beyond. The walls trembled, dust falling in thin streams from the ceiling. Mara's head snapped toward the sound, her pulse quickening. They're here, she hissed. Kalen raised his rifle, the motion fluid, instinctive. His voice cut through the rising panic like a blade through flesh. Positions, we hold this chamber. If they want their god back, they'll bleed for it. Mara slammed her hand against the console, the core's light flaring in response. Symbols cascaded across the surface, alien glyphs twisting into patterns she barely understood. She felt the machine's hunger, its vast awareness brushing against her mind like a predator testing its prey. She gritted her teeth, forcing her will into the interface. Give me control, she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and desire. Give me your fire. The core pulsed, a heartbeat of light that shook the chamber. For a moment Mara's vision blurred, her mind drowning in images of annihilation, worlds burning, fleets shattered, stars collapsing into silence. She gasped, her knees buckling, but she did not let go. Kalen's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder, steadying her. His voice was sharp, commanding. Stay with me, Mara, don't let it take you. She nodded, sweat dripping down her temple, her breath ragged. I can feel it. It wants to be used. It wants war. Rourke's laughter was a jagged edge in the air. Then give it what it wants. The rumble grew louder, closer. The enemy was advancing, their boots pounding against steel, their voices echoing in guttural commands. Shadows flickered at the edges of the chamber, the promise of violence imminent. Kalen raised his rifle, his voice a growl. Form a line, we hold until Mara bends that monster to our will. Rourke slid into position, his grin widening, his rifle steady despite the blood dripping from his fingers. Let them come, I'll paint the floor with their insides. The first enemy burst through the doorway, armored figures with eyes glowing like embers, rifles raised. Kalen fired, the crack of his weapon echoing like thunder. The shot tore through the lead soldier, his body crumpling in a spray of sparks and blood. Hold, Kalen roared, his voice a command that cut through the chaos. Mara screamed, her hands clawing at the console, her mind locked in battle with the core. She felt its resistance, its fury, its vast hunger pressing against her skull. She forced her will into it, her voice breaking. Obey me, the core flared, a surge of light that blinded the chamber. The enemy faltered, their movements stuttering, their optics flickering. Mara's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling, but she did not relent. Kalen fired again, his movements relentless, his voice commanding. Push them back, Rourke charged forward, his rifle blazing, his laughter echoing like madness. He slammed into the enemy line, his ferocity a storm that tore through their ranks. Blood sprayed, sparks flew, the chamber became a slaughterhouse. Mara's vision blurred, her mind drowning in the core's fury. She saw worlds burning, fleets collapsing, stars dying. She screamed, her voice raw, her hands tearing at the console. It's breaking, it's ours. The core convulsed, its surface cracking, light blazing. The enemy faltered, their movements slowing, their eyes dimming. They collapsed, their bodies crumpling, their claws falling still. Silence. Mara fell to her knees, her breath ragged, her face streaked with blood. She looked up, her eyes blazing. It's ours, the planet killer, it's bound to us now. Kalen's jaw clenched, his breath steady. He looked at the core, its light blazing, its power pulsing. He looked at Mara, her face streaked with blood, her eyes blazing. He looked at Rourke, his body battered, his grin wild, and in that moment he knew this was not just survival. This was vengeance. This was war. The planet killer was theirs, but the war was not over. Kalen's voice was low, steady, commanding. We move. The enemy will come for it, and when they do, we'll be ready. Mara nodded, her eyes blazing. Rourke spat blood, his grin feral, then let them come. They turned, their rifles steady, their bodies battered but unbroken. The chamber lay in ruins, the drones fallen, the core blazing, but beyond, the war waited. And they would not stop, they would not fall, they would not rot, they would fight, they would endure, they would win. The air tasted of ionized ozone and burnt circuitry, a metallic tang that clung to Mara's throat as she pushed herself upright from the slick deck plating. Blood crusted the corners of her mouth, drying into thin black lines that cracked when she breathed. Her vision swam at the edges, the after-image of the core seizure still flickering behind her eyelids, worlds unraveling in a cascade of white-hot light, stars snuffed out like candles in a gale. He forced the images down, focusing instead on the immediate, the hum of the planet killer's heart, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of her boots and up into her marrow. Kalen stood a few paces away, his silhouette framed by the jagged wreckage of the enemy drones. His armor, once pristine matte black, was now scored with scorch marks and pitted with shrapnel. The visor of his helmet was cracked, a spider web of fissures that distorted the pale glow of the core into a fractured halo. He didn't bother to wipe the blood from his cheek. It was a badge, a reminder that he had stared into the abyss and it had blinked back. "Status," he said, voice low but carrying the weight of command. It wasn't a question, it was an order that demanded immediacy. Mara's fingers flew over the console, her gloves slick with sweat and gore. The readouts blinked in a frantic cascade, power levels fluctuating, containment fields straining, secondary reactors threatening to overload. "Core integrity at 73%, she reported, her voice hoarse but steady. "Containment field holding, but the feedback loop is pushing the outer lattice to its limits. If we don't disengage the secondary cascade in the next 12 minutes, we'll have a runaway reaction that'll vaporize this sector and take the core with it." Rourke leaned against a bulkhead, his grin feral despite the blood that trickled from a split lip. He'd taken a plasma bolt to the shoulder earlier. The wound was sealed with a hastily applied med gel, but the pain pulsed in time with his heartbeat. 12 minutes. "Plenty of time to make them wish they never left their graves," he muttered, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ruined chamber where the corridor stretched into the ship's bowels. Kalen's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze toward the main hatch, where the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated in weak pulses, causing loose debris to drift lazily before settling again. "We can't stay here. The enemy will have sensed the surge. Their scout frigates are already looping back from the outer rim. We need to move the core to the secondary vault, deep enough that their sensors will be blinded by the planet's own magnetic anomaly." Mara's eyes flicked to the schematics hovering above the console, a translucent blueprint of the vessel's interior. The secondary vault lay 3 decks below, nestled within a reinforced titanium lattice that had been designed to house the ship's antimatter reserves. It was isolated, shielded by layers of borated carbide and a dormant gravitic field that could mask emissions. "If we can get the core there and re-engage the containment protocols, we'll buy ourselves a window, maybe hours, to rig a counter-strike." Kalen nodded, the motion sharp and decisive. "Rourke, you and I will handle the physical move. Mara, you stay here and keep the core stable. If the field starts to deviate, you shut it down manually, no hesitation. We'll rig a charge to collapse the main access tunnel behind us, buy us time." Mara's gaze flicked to the charge pack strapped to her thigh, a compact cylinder of plasma gel that could melt through bulkheads in seconds. She felt the weight of it not just as a tool but as a promise that she would not let the core fall into enemy hands again. "Copy," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'll keep the core from screaming." The 3 of them moved as a unit, each step echoing against the scarred hull. Kalen led, his rifle cradled across his chest, the barrel still warm from the last exchange. Rourke followed, his heavy gauntleted fist occasionally striking a protruding conduit to test its integrity. Mara brought up the rear, her eyes constantly darting to the readouts floating before her, her mind a whirl of calculations and worst-case scenarios. The corridor was a tableau of devastation. Sparks flew from severed power conduits, casting staccato flashes that painted the walls in strobing red and blue. Bits of twisted metal hung like macabre chandeliers, some still sparking, others frozen in the moment of impact. The smell of ozone grew stronger, mingling with the acrid scent of burnt polymer and the faint, sweet undertone of overheated coolant, an odor that reminded Mara of the infirmary back on the Ark, where she'd watched friends succumb to radiation sickness. Every few meters, they passed the remnants of the enemy drones, shells of alloy and servo motors, their optic lenses shattered, limbs splayed in grotesque poses. Kalen paused beside one, his gloved hand resting on its cold chassis. He could almost hear the echo of its last transmission, a garbled burst of alien syntax that had been cut short by the core's pulse. A surge of something unfamiliar, almost reverence, flared in his chest, then was quickly smothered by the cold calculus of war. These were not merely machines, they were the vanguard of a force that had sought to erase them. Their destruction was necessary, but it left a hollow taste. "Keep moving," Kalen whispered, more to himself than to his companions. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, each inhalation a reminder that the air was thin, filtered through scrubbers laboring to keep pace with the rising heat from the core's leakage. Mara's visor flickered as a warning icon blinked, field fluctuation detected. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a primal drum that threatened to drown out the rational voice in her head. She forced her fingers to steady, tapping a sequence into the console that rerouted auxiliary power to the stabilizers. The readout steadied, the numbers climbing back toward nominal. A thin she exhaled, the release of tension a small victory in a sea of impending chaos. They reached the secondary vault's access hatch, a massive slab of alloy etched with the ship's insignia, now scarred and pitted. The hydraulic groaned as Kalen placed his palm on the manual override, feeling the vibrations travel up his arm. With a grunt, he heaved the hatch open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic pulse of the core's containment field leaking through the cracks in the door. Inside, the vault was a cavern of reinforced steel, rows of rack-mounted antimatter pods standing like silent sentinels. In the center, a cylindrical cradle waited, its interior lined with superconducting coils designed to cradle the planet killer's heart without letting its energy touch the surrounding structure. The air was colder here, the temperature regulated by the vault's independent climate system, a stark contrast to the furnace-like heat of the upper decks. "Set it down," Kalen ordered, his voice reverberating off the metal walls. Rurk and Mara lifted the core together, its weight deceptive. Though it was no larger than a man's torso, the gravitational distortion it exerted made it feel like they were hauling a small moon. The core's surface rippled with internal light, veins of cerulean energy pulsing like living circuitry. As they maneuvered it into the cradle, Mara felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes, a flashback to the moment she had first linked her neural interface to the core during the initial capture. She saw in fragmented impressions the core's awareness, a hunger, a thirst for domination, a cold calculation that mirrored the enemy's own intent. She shuddered, forcing the vision away. The core settled with a soft, resonant thunk that seemed to echo through the vault's bones. Kalen snapped the magnetic locks into place, the seals hissing as they engaged. He then stepped back, his gaze sweeping the chamber for any signs of compromise. "Field status?" he asked, voice edged with impatience. Mara's hands flew over the secondary console mounted on the vault wall. The readouts were clean, containment at 98%, flux stable, no leakage. "We're good, core locked, secondary field online, no detectable emissions outside the vault's shielding." Rourke let out a harsh laugh that bounced off the steel. "So we've got a fucking star in a box, and we're sitting on it like it's a goddamn treasure chest. Let them come, let them try to pry it loose." Kalen's expression hardened. He pulled a compact detonator from his belt, the device's display blinking a soft green. "We'll make sure they regret even thinking about it." He attached the charge to the vault's outer reinforcement ring, a lattice of depleted uranium and graphene designed to absorb kinetic impacts. The charge was set to detonate on a proximity trigger, creating a controlled collapse that would seal the vault shut and bury any intruders under tons of debris. "Mara, keep monitoring. If the core spikes, you dump the charge manually, no hesitation. Rurk, you and I will take the perimeter. Set up kill zones at the junction points, claymores, EMP nets, tripwire lasers. We'll make every meter of this corridor a death trap." Mara nodded, her face set in grim determination. She slipped her glove off, exposing the bare skin of her palm to the cool metal of the console, feeling the subtle vibrations through the plating as if she could hear the core's heartbeat. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the faces of those she'd lost: Jensen, whose laughter had been cut short by a plasma burst; Leah, whose eyes had gone vacant as the radiation ate away at her mind. She felt the weight of their absence like a physical pressure, a reminder that failure was not an option. "Remember," she said, voice low but carrying, "we're not just protecting a weapon. We're protecting the chance to make them pay for every world they've burned, every friend they've turned to ash." Kalen's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat the war seemed to pause, the hum of the core the only sound in the universe. Then he gave a sharp, curt nod. "Move out." They slipped from the vault, the hatch sealing behind them with a final, resonant clang. The corridor beyond was dim, the emergency lights casting long, wavering shadows that made the wreckage appear almost alive, like the bones of some great beast waiting to stir. Kalen took point, his rifle sweeping left and right, his senses tuned to the slightest disturbance. Rurk fell into a staggered patrol pattern, laying down micro-explosives at intervals, each one camouflaged amid the debris with strips of polymer that matched the hull's hue. Mara stayed just behind them, her eyes never leaving the readout on her wrist-mounted console, her thumb hovering over the emergency dump switch. The minutes stretched, each second a taut wire ready to snap. The ship groaned as stress fractures shifted, tiny pops and creaks echoing like distant gunfire. Somewhere far above, the enemy's frigates loomed, their sensors probing the wreckage, seeking the signature of the planet killer's power. Mara could almost feel their presence, a cold pressure at the edge of her awareness, like a predator circling a wounded prey. She thought of the core's pulse, the way it resonated with something deep inside her, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, quickening with fear, slowing with resolve. She remembered the first time she had touched the core, the surge of knowledge that had flooded her mind, schematics of weapons, star maps, the enemy's battle doctrines. It had been a gift and a curse, a torrent of information that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. Now she clung to it, using the fragments not as a burden but as a weapon, each piece of intel a clue to how the enemy thought, how they moved, how they could be broken. A sudden spike flared on her console, anomaly detected. GRAVITIC distortion, 0.3 AU off port bow. Her breath hitched. The distortion was too precise to be natural. It was a signature of a gravitic scanner, the kind the enemy used to pinpoint high-energy sources through layers of shielding. Contact, she whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the core. Kalen halted, his rifle tightening against his shoulder. Where? Port bow, just beyond the junction at bulkhead 7-4. They're probing. Rourke's grin widened, a flash of teeth in the low light. Let M see what happens when they poke a hornet's nest. Kalen pressed his back against the cold bulkhead, listening. The ship's structural groans seemed to sync with the distant thrum of the enemy's engines, a low, subsonic vibration that could be felt more than heard. He could imagine the alien ship sliding silently through the void, their hulls absorbing starlight, their crews hunched over consoles, eyes narrowed as they parsed the data streaming in. Set the EMP net, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. Tripwire lasers at 10-meter intervals, claymores on the overhead conduits. We'll funnel them into the kill zone. Mara's fingers flew, deploying the net, a mesh of superconducting filaments designed to dump a massive electromagnetic pulse when triggered, capable of frying enemy avionics and scrambling their targeting systems. She set the tripwires, each a filament of diamagnetic thread that would snap a laser beam when disturbed, triggering a cascade of micro-explosives lined along the walls. The claymores were affixed to the ceiling, their conical charges aimed downwards, ready to unleash a storm of shrapnel that would turn the corridor into a meat grinder. The tension mounted as the enemy's presence grew nearer. The gravitic distortion sharpened, the reading on Mara's console climbing. She could almost hear the aliens' thoughts, calculations, assessments, the cold certainty that they would reclaim what was theirs. Then a soft, almost imperceptible click echoed from the junction ahead, a tripwire laser breaking. A flash of red blossomed in the darkness as the laser diode overloaded, sending a surge down the line. The first claymore detonated with a deafening crack, a sphere of molten metal erupting outward, shredding the air and sending a shockwave that rattled the deck plates. Kalen didn't wait for the echo to fade. He surged forward, rifle blazing, bolts of plasma lancing into the gloom. The enemy's silhouettes emerged from the smoke, tall, spindly figures clad in reflective carapace, their limbs jointed in unnatural ways, their heads dominated by multifaceted eyes that reflected the flickering light like obsidian beads. They raised their own weapons, barrel-like emitters that crackled with dark energy. Rourke met them halfway, his gauntleted fist swinging in a wide arc that smashed into the nearest alien's forearm, shattering the carapace and sending a spray of ichor onto the deck. He followed with a brutal elbow to the creature's throat, crushing its vocalizer and eliciting a guttural hiss that was cut short as the alien staggered backward, clutching at its ruined limb. Mara, though rooted to the console, felt the battle's pulse through the deck plates. Each impact sent a tremor through her boots, each plasma bolt's flash painted fleeting patterns on her visor. She caught glimpses of the enemy's faces, expressions unreadable, yet there was a flicker of surprise, perhaps even fear, as they realized their prey was not the helpless carcass they had expected. She forced herself to focus, her mind splitting between the tactical readout and the raw sensory data flooding in. The core's readings remained stable, but a subtle rise in secondary emissions hinted at a feedback loop beginning to form as the enemy's weapons interacted with the containment field. If they managed to breach the vault's outer shielding, the resulting cascade could destabilize the core entirely, an outcome that would obliterate them all. Hold the line, she thought, her jaw clenching. Hold the line and buy us enough time to blow this place sky high if we have to. Kalen's voice cut through the chaos, sharp as a blade. Fall back to the choke point, secondary barrier now. He barked the order, and the trio began a deliberate retreat, laying down suppressive fire as they moved. Rourke tossed a grenade, a plasma-filled sphere that detonated in a burst of searing white light, momentarily blinding the advancing aliens and buying them precious seconds. Mara, from her position behind a bulkhead, fired a controlled burst from her sidearm, each shot finding the joint of an alien's leg, sending it sprawling. They reached the choke point, a narrow section of the corridor where the bulkheads converged, the ceiling lowered by a collapsed support beam, forcing any attacker to single file. Here, Mara had pre-placed a directional charge, a shaped explosive designed to focus its blast forward like a spear. She armed it, the timer ticking down from 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1, now, she shouted, slamming the detonator. The charge erupted, a concentrated jet of superheated plasma that lanced down the corridor like a spear of pure energy. It struck the lead alien squarely in the chest, carving a hole through its carapace and out its back, the alien's body convulsing as its internal systems overloaded. The blast wave slammed into the following aliens, throwing them off balance, their weapons sputtering as the electromagnetic pulse from the disruption rippled through their armor. The enemy faltered, their advance halted. For a heartbeat, the corridor was silent save for the ragged breathing of the defenders and the dying wheezes of the alien casualties. Kalen seized the moment. Now, he roared, and they surged forward, rifles blazing, cutting down the stunned foes with ruthless efficiency. Plasma bolts found their marks, eyes, joints, the weak points in the carapace where the aliens' biomechanical systems were most exposed. The enemy's return fire was sporadic, their weapons disrupted by the lingering EMP field, their shots going wide or fizzling out before they could connect. Rurk, adrenaline surging, closed the distance with a feral grin, his combat knife flashing as he slit the throat of an alien that had managed to raise its weapon. The creature's eyes widened, then went dark as its lifeblood sprayed onto the deck, mixing with the already slick plasma residue. Mara, though not on the front line, felt each kill as a visceral jolt. She saw the enemy's faces contort in pain, heard the wet gurgle of collapsing lungs, smelled the acrid tang of burnt alien flesh mixed with the ever-present ozone. Each death was a small reclamation, a fragment of the vengeance they had sworn. When the last alien fell, the corridor lay in a tableau of devastation, broken carapace, smoking plasma burns, bodies twisted in unnatural poses. The air was thick with smoke and the faint, sweet smell of alien ichor. The hum of the core seemed louder now, as if reacting to the violence, its light pulsing in time with the survivors' heartbeats. Kalen stood amid the carnage, his chest heaving, his visor smeared with alien blood and his own. He lowered his rifle, the barrel still glowing hot from sustained fire. "Status?" he asked, voice hoarse but authoritative. Mara glanced at her console. The core's containment field was holding at 94%, fluctuations minimal. Secondary emissions were still within safe limits. "We're good," she replied, though her voice trembled just slightly. "No breach, field stable." Rurk kicked at a fallen alien's carapace, sending a clang echoing down the corridor. "They'll be back," he muttered, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the wreckage. "They've got more ships out there." More of those things. Kalen's gaze swept the length of the corridor, taking in the devastation, the spent casings, the scorched bulkheads. His mind raced through possibilities, reinforcements, ambushes, the likelihood that the enemy would attempt a boarding action via external docking clamps, or perhaps try to tunnel through the hull using seismic borers. He knew the fight was far from over. The planet killer was a prize worth any cost, and the enemy would not relinquish it easily. He turned to Mara, his expression hardening into something like resolve carved from stone. "We've bought ourselves a window, now we fortify. Seal the bulkheads, set up secondary kill zones, lay mines in the maintenance shafts. We make every inch of the ship a death trap, and when they come again," he let the sentence hang, the implication clear, "they would not just survive, they would make the enemy pay in blood for every step they took toward the core." Mara met his eyes, feeling the fire within her bank but not extinguished. She thought of the worlds they had lost, the comrades whose names were etched into her memory like scars. She thought of the core not just as a weapon, but as a promise that the darkness that had tried to consume them would, in the end, be consumed itself. "We'll be ready," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue clawing at her edges. "We'll make sure they never get close enough to touch it." Rurk let out a short, humorless laugh, wiping a smear of alien blood from his cheek with the back of his gauntlet. "Then let them bring their whole damn fleet. We'll turn this tub into a graveyard." The three of them stood together amidst the ruin, the planet killer's steady throb a beacon in the gloom, a reminder that they held the power to shatter worlds, and that they would not hesitate to use it if it meant seeing their enemies reduced to ash. The war was not over, it had only just begun. But for now they had bought themselves a breath, a chance to tighten the noose around the throat of the darkness that had sought to leave them to rot in the void. And they would not waste it. They would endure, they would fight, they would win. Chapter 7. The maintenance shafts were silent now, save for the faint hum of the reactor core resonating through the steel bones of the ship. Mara crouched low, her pulse hammering in her ears as she adjusted the charge on the improvised mines they had rigged along the corridor. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned insulation and alien ichor, the remnants of the last incursion still smeared across the walls. Every surface bore scars, scorch marks, gouges from claws, and the jagged edges of ruptured plating. This ship was no longer a vessel, it was a carcass, a tomb waiting to be filled. Rurk's boots clanged against the grated floor as he approached, his silhouette hulking in the dim red emergency lights. His armor was dented, blackened, and streaked with blood, some of it his, most of it not. He carried himself like a man who had already died once and was daring fate to try again. They'll come through here, he said, voice low, gravel grinding in his throat. He jabbed a finger toward the junction ahead, where the shaft split into 3 narrow arteries. They'll think it's a shortcut to the core, that's where we bleed them. Mara nodded, her hands trembling as she locked the final charge into place. The device was crude, scrap metal casing, a power cell ripped from a drone, and a plasma conduit wired to detonate on proximity. It wasn't elegant, but it would kill. That was all that mattered. Behind them, Kale emerged from the shadows, his face pale beneath the grime, eyes sharp and restless. He carried a rifle slung across his chest, its barrel scorched from overuse. He had the look of a man stretched thin, nerves frayed to the breaking point, but his movements were precise, deliberate. He was the kind of soldier who survived not by strength, but by refusing to falter. They'll send more than infantry this time, Kale muttered, scanning the shaft with a predator's gaze. Heavy units, breachers, maybe even one of their warforms. Rourke's jaw tightened. Then we make the shaft their coffin, collapse it if we have to. The core stays untouched. The 3 of them stood in silence, listening to the ship breathe. The planet killer's pulse reverberated through the walls, a steady rhythm that reminded them of the power they held and the danger it invited. Mara felt it in her bones, a vibration that seemed to whisper promises of annihilation. She wondered if the weapon was alive in some way, if it hungered for the destruction it was built to unleash. Her thoughts were broken by the faint tremor of footsteps echoing down the shaft. Alien voices, guttural and harsh, carried through the metal. The enemy was coming. Positions, Rourke barked, his voice snapping like a whip. Mara slid into the alcove beside the junction, pressing her back against the cold steel. She steadied her breathing, forcing her fear into a tight knot deep inside. Kale crouched opposite her, rifle raised, eyes narrowed. Rourke stood in the center, a wall of iron, his gauntlet resting on the trigger of the detonator. The shadows shifted as the first enemy scouts emerged. Their forms were grotesque, elongated limbs, armored carapaces glistening with slime, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. They moved with a predatory grace, weapons clutched in clawed hands. Mara's heart pounded. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the faint click of her rifle's safety disengaging. She thought of the worlds that had burned, the screams of civilians drowned in fire, the comrades who had fallen one by one until only scraps of their unit remained. She thought of the promise they had made to fight until the void itself swallowed them. The first alien stepped into the junction, Rourke's thumb pressed down. The shaft erupted in fire. The mine detonated with a thunderous roar, plasma tearing through steel and flesh alike. The blast hurled the scouts backward, their bodies shredded, their screams cut short, the corridor filled with smoke and the stench of charred meat. Hold, Rourke bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. More poured in, dozens, maybe hundreds. The shaft became a storm of gunfire, plasma bolts streaking through the smoke, ricocheting off walls. Mara fired, each shot precise, each kill a silent prayer for the dead. Kale's rifle spat fury, his movements mechanical, relentless. Rourke waded into the fray, his heavy weapon roaring, each burst tearing holes in the enemy ranks. The aliens surged forward, undeterred by the carnage. Their war cries reverberated through the steel, a chorus of hatred. Mara felt the walls closing in, the air thick with death. She ducked as a bolt seared past her head, the heat blistering her skin. She rolled, came up firing, her shots punching through an enemy's chest. Fall back, Kale shouted, his voice strained. No, Rourke roared, defiance burning in his eyes. We hold here, we break them here. The shaft shook as something massive approached, the warform. Its silhouette loomed in the smoke, a towering monstrosity of flesh and steel, its limbs bristling with weapons. Its eyes glowed like twin suns, casting the corridor in an eerie light. Mara's breath caught. She had seen warforms before on the battlefields of ruined colonies. They were engines of slaughter designed to crush resistance beneath their weight. Charges won't stop that, Kale hissed, panic flickering in his voice. Rourke's gaze hardened. Then we bring the shaft down. He slammed his fist onto the secondary detonator. Explosions rippled through the corridor, tearing supports from the walls, collapsing steel beams. The shaft groaned, shuddered, then gave way. The warform roared as the ceiling caved in, tons of debris crashing down, burying it in fire and rubble. The shockwave hurled Mara against the wall. Pain lanced through her ribs, her vision swimming. She tasted blood, felt the weight of dust settling over her. Through the haze, she saw Rourke dragging himself to his feet, his armor cracked, his face streaked with ash. Kale staggered beside him, coughing, his rifle clutched like a lifeline. Silence fell. The shaft was a ruin filled with smoke and broken bodies. The enemy advance had been halted for now. Mara forced herself upright, every muscle screaming. She looked at Rourke, at Kale, at the devastation they had wrought. They were alive, barely. Rourke's voice was a rasp, but it carried the weight of command. They'll send more. They'll never stop, but neither will we. Mara met his gaze, her fear tempered by resolve. Then let them come, we'll make this ship their grave. Kale wiped the blood from his mouth, his eyes burning with defiance. We'll fight until the core itself is the last thing standing. The three of them stood amidst the wreckage, battered but unbroken. The planet killer's pulse thrummed through the walls, steady, unyielding. It was a reminder of the power they held, of the promise they had made. They were soldiers abandoned in the void, left to rot, but they had the enemy's planet killer now, and they would wield it like a blade against the darkness. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 8, the corridor was a tomb of steel and ash. Every step Mara took echoed against the fractured plating, the sound swallowed by the smoke that hung thick in the air. Her lungs burned with each breath, the acrid taste of scorched circuitry clinging to her tongue. The emergency lights flickered, casting the wreckage in pulses of blood-red illumination, as if the ship itself bled out around them. Rourke moved ahead, his silhouette broad and unyielding despite the cracks in his armor. His gait was heavy, deliberate, each step a declaration that he would not falter. Cale followed close, rifle raised, eyes darting through the haze for movement. The three of them were shadows in a graveyard, soldiers stitched together by defiance and desperation. The planet killer's pulse reverberated through the walls, a low, thrumming heartbeat that seemed to mock them. It was alive in its own way, an engine of annihilation waiting to be unleashed. Mara felt it in her bones, a vibration that reminded her of the promise they had made, to wield this weapon against the enemy, even if it consumed them in the process. A sudden groan of metal made them freeze. The corridor ahead twisted, bulkheads warped from the blast. Rourke raised a hand, signaling silence. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs, the pain sharp, but she forced herself to steady her breathing. Cale crouched, rifle angled toward the shadows. Then came the sound, boots against steel, faint but unmistakable, enemy reinforcements. Rourke's voice was low, commanding, "Positions, we hold here." Mara pressed herself against the wall, her pistol trembling in her grip. She could feel the sweat slicking her palms, the weight of exhaustion dragging at her limbs. Cale slid into cover behind a collapsed support beam, his rifle steady despite the tremor in his hands. The enemy emerged from the smoke, figures clad in black armor, visors glowing with cold light. They moved with precision, rifles raised, their formation tight. Mara's stomach knotted. These weren't the scattered remnants they had fought before. This was a strike team sent to finish what the collapse had failed to do. Rourke stepped forward, his voice a growl that cut through the tension. "You want this ship, you'll bleed for it." The firefight erupted in a storm of light and sound. Mara fired, the recoil jolting through her injured ribs, each shot a lance of agony. Cale's rifle spat bursts of plasma, cutting through the smoke, striking armor and flesh. Rourke charged, his heavy weapon roaring, the muzzle flash illuminating his scarred face. The corridor became chaos. Sparks showered from ruptured conduits, smoke billowed, and the screams of dying soldiers mingled with the thunder of gunfire. Mara ducked behind cover, her breath ragged, her mind screaming at her to keep moving. She peeked out, fired again, saw one of the enemy collapse, his visor shattering in a spray of glass and blood, but they kept coming. Cale's voice was sharp, desperate. "They're pushing us back," Rourke snarled, slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. "Then push harder." Mara felt the walls closing in, the weight of inevitability pressing down. She thought of the void outside, the endless silence of deep space, and the truth that had haunted them since they were abandoned. No one was coming to save them. They were alone, left to rot, and yet they fought. She rose from cover, pain screaming through her body, and fired into the advancing line. Her shots found their mark, dropping 2 more soldiers. Cale shifted position, his rifle blazing, cutting down another. Rourke surged forward, his weapon a hammer of fury, forcing the enemy to falter. The tide shifted, the strike team hesitated, their formation breaking under the relentless assault. Mara saw it, the flicker of doubt, the fracture in their resolve. She seized it, pressing forward, her pistol barking, her voice raw with defiance. "This is our ship, our grave, you'll never take it." The enemy faltered, then broke. The survivors retreated into the smoke, their boots pounding against steel as they fled. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of ruptured conduits and the ragged breaths of the 3 soldiers who remained. Mara collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving, her vision swimming. Cale lowered his rifle, his hands shaking, his face pale beneath the grime. Rourke stood tall, his weapon still raised, his eyes burning with the fire of command. He lowered the weapon slowly, his voice a rasp. "They'll send more, stronger, smarter." "But we'll be ready." Mara closed her eyes, the weight of exhaustion pressing down, but she forced herself to nod. "We'll make this ship their grave. Every corridor, every bulkhead will bleed them dry." Cale wiped the blood from his mouth, his voice hoarse but resolute. "We'll fight until the core itself is the last thing standing." The planet killer's pulse thrummed through the walls, steady, unyielding. It was a reminder of the power they held, of the promise they had made. They were soldiers abandoned in the void, left to rot, but they had the enemy's planet killer now, and they would wield it like a blade against the darkness. Rourke turned, his gaze sweeping the ruined corridor, the broken bodies, the smoke that clung like a shroud. His voice was iron. "We hold the line, we hold the weapon, and when the time comes, we unleash hell." Mara felt the words settle into her bones, a vow carved into the marrow of her soul. She looked at Kale, at Rourke, at the devastation around them, and she knew they were alive, barely, but alive, and the war was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 9. The corridor was a tomb of steel and smoke. Every breath Mara drew scraped her lungs raw, the air thick with the stench of scorched alloy and charred flesh. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting the wreckage in a sickly crimson pulse that matched the heartbeat of the planet killer itself. The ship was alive, thrumming with power, whispering promises of annihilation through its walls. Rourke moved first, his boots grinding over shattered plating, the sound sharp and deliberate. He carried himself like a man carved from iron, every motion precise, every glance calculated. His rifle hung low but ready, the barrel still hot from the last exchange. He paused at the junction, eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. Kale, he rasped, voice gravel dragged across stone. Check the flank. Mara with me. Kale swallowed hard, his throat raw, but he obeyed. He slipped into the side corridor, his movements jittery, the tremor in his hands betraying the exhaustion gnawing at him. His boots splashed through a pool of coolant, the liquid reflecting the red light like blood. He raised his rifle, every nerve screaming, every shadow a threat. Mara pushed herself off the wall, her legs trembling but her will unbroken. She followed Rourke, her hand brushing the cold steel bulkhead for balance. Her mind was a storm, fear, rage, fatigue all colliding, but beneath it burned a singular purpose, survival. She forced her breathing steady, forced her eyes to stay sharp. They reached the junction. Rourke crouched low, his gaze fixed on the sealed blast door ahead. The door bore fresh scars, scorch marks, gouges from claws or blades. The enemy had tried to breach it, failed for now. They'll regroup, Rourke muttered, his voice low, meant only for Mara. They'll come harder, they know what we hold. Mara nodded, her jaw tight. Then we make them bleed for every step. Rourke's lips curled into something between a snarl and a grim smile. Good. Kale's voice crackled over the comm bead, strained but urgent. Movement, rear corridor, multiple contacts. Rourke's head snapped toward Mara, his eyes burned with command. Positions. Now they moved like soldiers forged in fire. Mara dropped to one knee behind a collapsed support strut, her rifle braced against the jagged metal. Rourke took the center, standing tall, his silhouette framed by the flickering red light. Kale slid back into view, his face pale, his eyes wide, but his weapon steady. The sound came first, metal claws scraping against steel, guttural growls reverberating through the corridor. Then the shadows shifted and the enemy emerged. They were not men, not anymore. Twisted forms clad in black armor, their visors glowing with sickly green light. Their movements were predatory, deliberate, each step echoing with menace. Rourke raised his rifle. Hold until they're in the kill zone. Mara's finger tightened on the trigger, her pulse syncing with the planet killer's thrum. Kale swallowed, his breath ragged, but he steadied his aim. The first enemy crossed the threshold. Rourke's rifle barked, the shot tearing through armor, dropping the creature in a spray of sparks and ichor. Mara fired next, her round punching through a visor, the body collapsing in a twitching heap. Kale's burst caught two more, shredding them in a hail of fire, but they kept coming. The corridor erupted into chaos. Gunfire roared, muzzle flashes strobing against the crimson light. The enemy surged forward, relentless, their claws raking against steel, their weapons spitting green bolts that scorched the walls. Mara ducked behind cover, her heart hammering, the heat of plasma bolts searing past her. She popped up, fired, dropped another. Her shoulders screamed from recoil, but she ignored it. She was a soldier. Pain was irrelevant. Kale screamed as a bolt grazed his arm, the flesh sizzling. He staggered, but Rourke's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Stand your ground, Kale. Fight, Kale gritted his teeth, rage flooding his veins. He raised his rifle, unleashed a storm of fire, his shots wild but deadly. Two enemies fell, their bodies convulsing as they hit the deck. Rourke was a wall of fury. He advanced, each shot precise, each movement calculated. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his rhythm unbroken, his presence a pillar in the storm. The enemy faltered, their advance slowed. Bodies littered the corridor, smoke rising from shattered armor, but still one remained, larger, stronger. Its armor gleamed blacker than the void, its visor burning brighter. It stepped over the corpses, its weapon raised, its gaze fixed on Rourke. Rourke met its stare, his jaw set. He lowered his rifle, drew the combat blade from his belt. The steel glinted in the red light. Mine, he growled. The creature roared, a sound that shook the walls. It charged. Rourke moved like a predator unleashed. He sidestepped, blade flashing, carving deep into the creature's side. Sparks flew, ichor sprayed. The creature swung, claws raking the air, but Rourke ducked low, drove the blade upward into its chest. The creature convulsed, its roar dying in a gurgle. Rourke ripped the blade free, kicked the body aside. It collapsed, twitching, then stilled. Silence fell. Mara's breath came in ragged gasps. Kale leaned against the wall, clutching his burned arm, his face pale but alive. Rourke stood tall, his blade dripping, his chest heaving. He turned, his eyes burning with fire. This ship is ours. This weapon is ours, and we will wield it until the stars themselves tremble. Mara felt the words sink into her bones, a vow etched into her soul. She looked at Kale, at Rurk, at the corridor littered with corpses. They were broken, battered, bleeding, but they were alive, and the planet killer thrummed, its pulse steady, unyielding. The war was not over, it had only just begun. Chapter 10, Reckoning. As Rurk's declaration echoed through the corridor, the silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of their shared trauma. Mara's eyes darted between her comrades, searching for signs of life, of hope. Kale's gaze remained fixed on his arm, his face a mask of pain and determination. Rurk, still clutching his blade, surveyed the carnage around them, his jaw clenched in defiance. The air reeked of ozone, smoke, and something more sinister, the stench of death. The walls ran with rivulets of ichor, pooling on the deck like a dark, viscous liquid. The creatures' bodies, charred and twisted, lay strewn about, their once human features now distorted beyond recognition. Mara's thoughts were fragmented, her mind racing to process the sheer scale of destruction. She recalled the screams, the chaos, the relentless onslaught of attacks that had ravaged their ship. Yet, in this moment, a glimmer of resolve began to take shape within her. She pushed off from the wall, her movements cautious as she approached Rurk. "We need to get moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That thing can't be the only one left." Rurk's gaze snapped toward her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her shiver. "You're right," he growled, tucking the blade into its scabbard. "We can't stay here, we have to find a way out of this hellhole." Kale winced as he stood up, his burned arm flapping limply at his side. "I'm good," he said, his voice laced with pain and exhaustion. "Let's just get this over with." The three of them moved in silence, their footsteps echoing through the corridors as they searched for a way off the planet killer. They navigated through the wreckage-strewn passageways, avoiding pools of blood and debris that seemed to stretch on forever. As they progressed, Mara noticed subtle changes in her companion's behavior. Rurk's usual stoicism was tempered by an underlying anger, his eyes flashing with a desire for vengeance at every new horror they encountered. Kale's pain had given way to a quiet resolve, his jaw clenched as he pushed through the agony. Mara felt her own emotions oscillating between numbness and rage. She struggled to reconcile the person she once was, a proud, confident warrior, with the battered, broken individual she'd become. The memories of those she'd lost still lingered, haunting her like ghosts. Their search led them to the ship's command center, where they found the remnants of their crew scattered about, many beyond recognition. Mara felt a pang of grief wash over her as she gazed upon the wreckage, familiar faces now frozen in death, their eyes forever silenced by the horrors that had unfolded around them. Rurk stood at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the devastation. "We were left to rot," he muttered, his voice heavy with despair. Left to face this monstrosity alone. Mara approached him slowly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "We're not alone," she said softly. "We have each other, and we have this ship." Kale limped forward, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of grief and determination. "We can still make a difference," he said, his voice barely audible. Rurk's gaze snapped toward them, his expression hardening into a mask of resolve. "Then let's get to work," he growled. "We have a planet to save." As they stood there, surrounded by the ruins of their ship and the silence of the void, Mara felt a spark of hope ignite within her. It was fragile, flickering, but it was there, a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war. And so, with heavy hearts and determined spirits, they set out to reclaim their ship, to rebuild what had been lost, and to forge a new path forward in the face of an unforgiving universe. Chapter 11, The hum of the dying reactor was a low, throbbing ache that seemed to vibrate through Mara's molars. She stood before the main power console, fingers slick with sweat and grease, feeling the cold bite of the ship's metal against her palms as she traced the scarred circuitry with a gloved thumb. The display flickered, a jaundiced amber that threw long, wavering shadows across the bulkheads, shadows that looked for a heartbeat like the silhouettes of the dead crew still slumped in their seats, eyes wide and unseeing. She forced the image away. The dead were a weight she could not afford to carry into the fight ahead. "Power reroute at 37%, Rurk barked, his voice rasping from the command chair where he had wedged himself between a shattered console and a bulkhead buckled from impact. His jaw was set, the scar that ran from his left cheek to his chin, catching the dim light like a fresh wound. "We need the thrusters online before the next drift cycle. If we lose attitude control, we'll tumble into the debris field and become another tomb." Mara's gaze flicked to the readout scrolling across the cracked screen, auxiliary power routing through the damaged port nacelle, a labyrinth of frayed fiber optics and melted alloy. She could feel the ship's wounded heart beating unevenly, each pulse a reminder of how close they were to total failure. "Kale," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her throat, "take the port side junction. Bypass the relay on frame 12. If the coolant lines are intact, we can siphon a little extra juice from the secondary loop. It'll buy us minutes, maybe enough to fire the main drives." Kale limped over, his left leg a stiff metallic protest after the shrapnel had torn through his muscle and bone. He leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch forged from a broken bulkhead panel, the metal biting into his palm with each step. His eyes, usually bright with the restless curiosity of a scout, were now narrowed, scanning the wreckage for any sign of further instability. "Copy," he muttered, his breath fogging the visor of his helmet as he moved. "If the coolant's breached, we'll have a plasma leak before we even get to the thrusters. I'll seal it with the emergency epoxy, if it holds." Mara watched him disappear into the gloom of the starboard corridor, his boots clanking against the deformed grating. The sound echoed like a death knell in the cavernous hallway, each reverberation a reminder of the emptiness that surrounded them. She turned her attention back to the console, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and half-remembered procedures from academy drills that felt like a lifetime ago. A sudden, sharp hiss snapped her focus to the overhead vent. A thin stream of violet-tinged plasma curled out from a fracture in the coupling, sputtering like a wounded serpent. The temperature readout spiked, the numbers bleeding red across the display. "Plasma breach in vent 7, she shouted, her voice cracking against the metal walls. "Seal it now." Rourke jerked upright, the chair screeching against the deck as he lunged toward the source. He grabbed a fire suppression canister from a nearby rack, its label faded but still legible, Class C plasma inhibitor. He slammed the canister against the vent, the hiss intensifying for a heartbeat before a thick, white foam erupted, smothering the plasma tendrils. The vent shuddered, then fell silent, the foam solidifying into a crusty seal that crackled faintly as it cooled. "Good," Rourke growled, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "But we're burning through our reserves fast. Every second we spend patching leaks is a second the enemy's planet killer gets closer to locking onto us." Mara's eyes darted to the tactical display, a holographic map of the system projected from the damaged nav array. A red blip pulsed ominously near the outer rim of the asteroid belt, the signature of the enemy's dreadnought, the Maw, its weapons arrays glowing like a malignant star. The planet killer, a massive obsidian monolith strapped to the dreadnought's dorsal spine, was charging, its core emanating a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of space. "We can't outrun it," Kale's voice crackled over the comm, strained but audible from the port junction. "The thrusters won't hold if we try to burn at full tilt. We need to turn the tables." Mara felt a cold prickle at the base of her skull. The idea was insane, suicidal even, but the alternative was a slow, certain death as the planet killer's beam sliced through their hull and turned their ship into a cloud of ionized dust. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the words carried the weight of a command. Kale's silhouette appeared in the doorway, his face half lost in shadow, the visor reflecting the flickering console lights. "We've got the enemy's own weapon schematic in the data core partial, but enough. If we can overload the planet killer's charge capacitors with a feedback surge from our own reactor, we might cause a premature detonation. It'll take out the dreadnought's forward batteries and give us a window to jump." Mara's mind raced. The risk was catastrophic. A miscalculation could ignite their own reactor, turning the ship into a nova that would consume them and the surrounding debris. Yet the thought of doing nothing, of watching the planet killer charge and then unleash its world-shattering blast on the colony they'd sworn to protect, was worse. "All right," she said, firmer now. "Rourke, divert all auxiliary power to the aft capacitor banks. Kale, you and I will manually splice the phase inverter into the killer's feed line. We'll need to keep the reactor output steady at 95%, any fluctuation, and we blow ourselves apart." Rourke gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "Power reroute initiated, diverting to aft banks now. Keep your heads down. If this goes sideways, we won't have time for second thoughts." Mara moved with purpose, her boots slipping slightly on the slick deck as she hurried to the engineering hatch. The air grew warmer, the scent of ozone thickening as the reactor strained under the imposed load. She could feel the vibrations through the soles of her feet, a low thrum that resonated with the planet killer's own charge, a grim duet of impending destruction. Inside the engineering bay, the scene was chaos tempered by desperation. Conduits lay exposed, sparking intermittently as damaged insulation gave way. Kale was already at the junction box, his hands moving with a practiced, albeit painful, dexterity. He wore a pair of insulated gauntlets, the fingers scorched black from earlier work. He glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something else, fear perhaps, but masked tightly. "Ready?" he asked, his voice muffled by the gauntlets. Mara nodded, gripping the phase inverter, a cylindrical device humming with stored energy. She aligned it with the exposed feed line that ran from the reactor to the aft capacitor banks, the very line that, if fed back into the planet killer's charge circuit, could create a feedback loop of catastrophic proportion. "On my mark," she said, inhaling sharply. 3, 2, 1 now." She slammed the inverter into the conduit, locking it with a magnetic clamp. Instantly, a surge of bright blue-white arced across the connection, the inverter absorbing the reactor's output and redirecting it back toward the aft banks. The ship shuddered, a deep groan echoing through the hull as the power flow reversed direction momentarily. Cale's eyes widened as he read the feedback monitor. The inverter's holding. We're pushing 97% into the kill line. A sudden, violent jolt threw them both against the bulkhead. The reactor alarm screamed, a piercing wail that cut through the ambient hum. The readouts flashed red, reactor core temperature spiking, pressure climbing beyond safe limits. Shut it down now, Rourke's voice came over the comm, raw with urgency. Mara's mind went blank for a fraction of a second, then snapped back. She slammed her palm onto the emergency cutoff, a massive red button recessed into the console. The reactor's whine dropped to a low, shuddering thrum as the flow of plasma was diverted into the emergency dump vents. Steam hissed violently, filling the bay with a thick, white fog that obscured their vision. Through the haze, she saw Cale struggling to his feet, his gauntlet sparking where it had contacted the live conduit. Blood welled from a cut on his forehead, dripping onto the metal floor and evaporating instantly in the heat. "Status," she shouted, coughing against the acrid smoke. "The inverter's holding, but the feedback is destabilizing the killer's charge cycle," Cale gasped, his voice hoarse. "If we maintain this for another 12 seconds, the overload should trigger a premature discharge. After that, we need to cut the line and jump." Mara glanced at the tactical display again. The enemy dreadnought's planet killer was now pulsing erratically, its usual steady glow replaced by a spasmodic flicker, like a heart beating out of rhythm. The dreadnought's hull plates were beginning to glow orange at the edges, a sign of internal stress. "Hold it," she ordered, her voice steel. "Hold the line, Cale, keep the inverter locked. Rourke, prep the jump coordinates. We'll need a clean vector out of the belt the second the killer blows." The seconds stretched, each one a thin blade of tension slicing through her thoughts. She could hear the distant, low moan of the planet killer building to a crescendo, a sound that felt like the universe itself holding its breath. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with the grime on her cheeks. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to drown out the ship's groans. At the 11th second, a blinding flash erupted from the dreadnought's dorsal spine. The planet killer's core detonated in a sphere of violet-white plasma, expanding outward with terrifying speed. The shockwave slammed into the ASF's hull, a thunderous impact that sent a shudder through every bulkhead, every rivet, every strand of fiber optic cable. Alarms blared, warning of hull breach in Sector 4, but the main structural integrity held for now. Mara clung to the console, knuckles white, as the view through the forward viewport filled with the expanding fireball. For a heartbeat, she saw the enemy dreadnought silhouetted against the inferno, its hull cracking, fragments spraying like shrapnel into the void. Then, as the plasma wave began to dissipate, a gaping hole yawned in the dreadnought's side, its forward batteries exposed, sparking and dead. "Now," Rourke bellowed, his voice a raw roar over the cacophony. "Engage the jump drive." Mara slammed her palm onto the jump initiation switch. The drive cores whined to life, a sound like 1,000 angels screaming in unison as they spun up to superluminal frequencies. The ship lurched forward, spacetime stretching around them as the ASF slipped into the slipstream, the stars outside elongating into streaks of pure light. The transition was violent, a sensation of being pulled apart at the subatomic level before being snapped back together. When the view cleared, they were no longer amidst the asteroid belt's deadly dance. Instead, they floated in the relative calm of deep space, the enemy dreadnought a dying ember behind them, its planet killer a spent husk drifting silently in the vacuum. Mara sank back into the chair, the adrenaline draining from her limbs, leaving a hollow exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She stared at the holo display, where the red blip of the enemy ship pulsed weakly, then faded as its power core sputtered out. Cale slumped against the bulkhead, his breathing ragged, blood still trickling from his temple. He looked at her, eyes bleary but alive. "We did it," he whispered, voice barely audible over the fading hum of the jump drive. We bought ourselves a chance." Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The weight of the dead crew pressed upon her still, but now it was mixed with something else, a fragile, fierce resolve. They had turned the enemy's own weapon against them, snatched a sliver of victory from the jaws of annihilation. Outside the viewport, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Somewhere far ahead, the planet they had sworn to protect waited, unaware of the narrow escape that had just unfolded in the black. Mara tightened her grip on the arm of her chair, feeling the metal's chill seep into her skin, and whispered to the void, "We're not done yet." Chapter 12, Ashes of the Planet Killer. The silence after the jump was not silence at all. It was the groaning of metal, the faint hiss of coolant lines bleeding into the air, the ragged breaths of survivors who had not yet realized they were alive. The ship's hull creaked like an old leviathan dragged from the depths, its bones strained by forces no human vessel was meant to endure. Mara forced herself upright, her muscles trembling as though gravity had doubled. The command deck was a ruin, panels scorched, hollow displays flickering with static, the acrid stench of burnt circuitry clawing at her throat. She could taste copper and smoke. Her hand brushed the armrest of her chair, and flakes of charred paint came away like ash. Kale staggered forward, one hand pressed to his bleeding temple, the other gripping the bulkhead as if the ship itself might buck him off. His voice was hoarse, but it carried the weight of command. Status. I want damage reports, now. The surviving crew snapped into motion, their exhaustion buried beneath drilled reflex. Fingers danced across cracked consoles, voices barked over the comms. Primary reactor stable, barely. Secondary grid offline. Life support holding, but we've lost filtration in sections 7 through 9. Navigation is God's, navigation is shredded, we're blind. Mara's eyes locked on the viewport. Beyond the fractured glass, the stars stretched in cold indifference. And there, drifting like a corpse in the void, was the enemy's planet killer. Its once glorious hull was torn open, jagged wounds venting frozen atmosphere into the abyss. The weapon that had promised annihilation now hung powerless, a monument to their defiance. Her chest tightened. Victory was a word too fragile for what they had achieved. This was survival, raw and bloody. Kale's gaze followed hers. We've crippled their god machine, he said, voice low, almost reverent. But don't think for a second they'll let us keep it. The words struck Mara like a blade. He was right. The enemy would come. They always came. The comm crackled, distorted by static. Lieutenant Rin's voice cut through, sharp and urgent. Captain, we're picking up residual energy signatures. The planet killer's core isn't dead, it's dormant. There's still power in there. A silence fell over the deck, heavy and suffocating. Mara felt the weight of every eye turned toward her. Dormant, not destroyed, her mind raced. If they could seize the weapon, if they could harness even a fraction of its power, the tide of war could shift. But the thought carried poison. To wield the enemy's planet killer was to invite damnation. Kale stepped closer, his face pale beneath the streaks of blood. Mara, if we leave it, they'll reclaim it, if we take it. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. If we take it, we become something else. Mara's jaw clenched. She could feel the decision pressing down on her, heavier than any battlefield command. The ghosts of the dead whispered in her ears, demanding justice, demanding vengeance. Prepare a boarding team, she said finally, her voice iron. We're not leaving that weapon for them. The crew moved with grim purpose. Armor was strapped on, rifles checked, blades sheathed. The boarding bay filled with the metallic scent of oil and sweat, the air vibrating with the unspoken knowledge that few would return. Mara led them. She would not send her people into the jaws of hell without walking beside them. The shuttle detached with a shudder, its thrusters igniting against the black. The planet killer loomed ahead, a broken titan, its surface scarred by battle yet still radiating menace. As they approached, Mara felt the weight of its presence pressing against her skull, as though the machine itself resented their intrusion. The docking clamps bit into twisted alloy. The hatch hissed open and the boarding team spilled into the carcass of the weapon. Inside was a graveyard, corridors stretched like veins through the beast, walls scorched, bodies frozen in grotesque tableaus. Enemy soldiers lay scattered, their armor cracked, their faces locked in expressions of terror. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of boots on debris. Kale's voice echoed through the comm. Stay sharp, if the core's alive there may be defenses. They advanced deeper, weapons raised, nerves taut, the air grew colder, the shadows thicker. Mara's breath fogged inside her helmet, each exhale a reminder of her mortality. Then they reached it. The core chamber was vast, a cathedral of machinery. Towers of alloy rose like pillars, cables snaked across the floor like roots. At the center, suspended in a cradle of steel, pulsed the heart of the planet killer, a sphere of light, fractured yet burning, its glow casting long, jagged shadows across the chamber. Mara felt her knees weaken. The power radiating from the core was not merely energy, it was hunger, a living force that clawed at her mind, whispering promises of dominion, of fire raining upon worlds. Kale's voice trembled. Gods, it's still awake. The team spread out, rifles trained on the sphere as though bullets could wound it. Mara stepped forward, her boots ringing against the metal floor. We take control, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. We turn their weapon against them. Rin's protest was immediate. Captain, this thing isn't a weapon, it's a curse. You saw what it did. It doesn't just kill planets, it devours them. If we use it, we're no better than them. Mara turned, her eyes burning. Better died with our crew. Better died when they burned our colonies. We don't have the luxury of better, we have survival. The chamber fell silent. The crew stared at her, torn between fear and loyalty. Kale stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers, grounding her. Then we survived together. Mara nodded. She raised her rifle not to fire, but to signal. Secure the core, patch into its systems. If it resists, we burn it out. If it obeys, her voice hardened. If it obeys, we make them fear us. The team moved, engineers unpacking tools, soldiers forming a perimeter. Sparks flew as panels were pried open, cables rerouted, consoles hacked. The core pulsed faster, its light flaring as though aware of their intrusion. Mara watched, her heart pounding. She could feel the abyss staring back at her, daring her to step closer, and she did. Her hand touched the console and the core's light surged, flooding the chamber with brilliance. For a heartbeat, she felt everything, the weight of stars, the scream of dying worlds, the infinite hunger of the machine. It wanted her. It wanted to be used, she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "We're not done yet," the core answered with a pulse that shook the chamber, a resonance that echoed through the ship, through her bones, through the void itself. And in that moment Mara knew they had not merely survived. They had claimed the enemy's god machine, but at what cost she could not yet see. The chamber dimmed, the core's light settling into a steady, ominous glow. The crew exhaled, relief mingled with dread. Kale's eyes met hers, haunted. "We've taken their planet killer." Mara's voice was a whisper, carried on the edge of despair and defiance. "No, it's taken us." Outside, the stars burned cold, indifferent witnesses to humanity's descent into the abyss. And somewhere far ahead, the war waited, hungering for what they had become.